These photographs were all taken from the same small patch of wildflowers, not in a famous garden, not on a photography trip, not even in a beautiful countryside location, just a few feet away from our back door. Over 6 weeks I photographed this patch of red campion again and again, using everything from macro lenses and telephotos to vintage lenses that turn flowers into something that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale. What started as a simple lens comparison quickly became something far more interesting, because the more time I spent photographing these flowers, the more I discovered that sometimes the most magical photography subjects aren't the ones that we travel hundreds of miles to find. Sometimes they're already waiting for us at home. And somewhere along the way, I accidentally turned a lens test into a 6-week experiment in slowing down. Some days I have the energy to head off in search of subjects. Other days I don't. But I still want to create. I still want to pick up a camera. And I still need occasional reminders that photography doesn't always require an expedition. We have lots of wildflowers in our garden to encourage wildlife, and a good 8-foot patch of red campion flowers which can flower for months on end. So I decided to spend a few minutes on several days each week with this small patch of red campion grown in the garden. I already sit outside most days to get my daily dose of sunshine and nature anyway. My plan seemed simple enough. Photograph the flowers with a variety of lenses, but all wide open for a nice dreamy effect. Compare the results to see which I enjoyed the most. Enjoy using some lenses that rarely leave the camera cupboard. And maybe learn a little bit about flower photography along the way. What could possibly go wrong? 6 weeks later, I was sitting in the rain, talking to the flowers. I'd apparently made friends with a bee. The local birds became so used to me that they barely noticed my existence. And I still wasn't entirely sure whether I was testing lenses or preparing to become part of the garden furniture. The lens that created the most magical images was my modified Helios. This is a vintage lens with manual focus. Very little is in focus with this lens wide open, and really you only get tack-sharp focus in the centre. But this lens isn't about sharpness. This lens has had its front element reversed, creating an effect that feels almost enchanted. Everything glows and softens, and the flowers seem to radiate light from within. Red campion has long been linked to folklore and fairies, and some stories suggest that the flowers helped conceal fairies from human eyes. And looking through this lens, it feels entirely possible that they succeeded. Just looking through the lens makes me feel like I'm right there in a fairy tale, where the fairies have cast a mystical spell on the lens. These photographs don't feel like records of a flower, but more like a dream. The standard Helios remains one of my favourite lenses to use. Wide open at f2, it produces an incredibly soft and dreamy rendering. Admittedly, achieving sharp focus can sometimes feel like you're entering into negotiations with the lens. I found it behaves best when I place my point of focus near the centre and crop later if needed. This is the same with the modified version too. But perfection was never really the goal of this project. I wanted images that made me feel something, and few lenses create atmosphere quite like the Helios. For all of the vintage lenses, I needed to use an M42 adapter to fit my camera, and I paired them with the extension tubes to enable me to get closer to the flowers. The Mayer Gaulet's Primoplan gave me wonderfully unpredictable results. On sunny days following rain showers, the famous soap bubble bouquet occasionally appeared. Sometimes it was spectacular, other times it disappeared entirely. It's a lens that refuses to follow instructions. But when everything comes together, the results have a softness and a character that's difficult to replicate with modern optics. This is often my go-to lens for dreamy softness. Although this next lens does have some similarities. The TTArtisan lens was something of a surprise. I've only used it 3 times up to now. It's a recent purchase. Yet during this project it produced some of my favourite images. Used with an extension tube, it gave me much of the character that I love from vintage lenses, while still retaining excellent sharpness where I needed it. The light and lens simply seemed to work together beautifully. It also appeared to have a slight vintage colour cast at times. One of the biggest surprises from this project was discovering just how capable some of my modern lenses were when it came to creating dreamy flower photographs. We often talk about vintage lenses when discussing softness and atmosphere, but modern lenses can be surprisingly magical too. The humble 50mm was a lens I really wanted to enjoy. It spends far too much time sitting unused in a drawer. Initially though, I struggled. The flowers seemed sort of lost within the frame. The images weren't quite giving me the feeling that I wanted. And then I added an extension tube, and everything changed. Suddenly, I could move much closer. Wide open at f1.8, the flowers melted beautifully into soft backgrounds. The humble 50 did produce some nice images, but was not a favourite. I did notice, however, some slight chromatic aberration with this lens, even on fairly dull, cloudy days. The 85mm is normally reserved for portraits, but it turned out to be wonderfully suited to dreamy flower photography. It allowed individual flowers to become the stars of the image, whilst maintaining beautifully soft backgrounds. In some cases, that glowing background wasn't another flower at all. It was Michael's shed, thankfully rendered completely unrecognisable by using f1.8. Following my recent Dreamy Flowers video, I wanted to spend more time exploring wider perspectives. I rarely use a wide-angled lens for flowers, but they allow something different. Instead of isolating the flower, they keep it connected to its surroundings. The result feels less like a flower portrait and more like an invitation into a scene. It didn't really give me the dreamy results, so I added an extension tube as usual to see what difference it made, but I still wasn't really enthralled with the images. The 90mm macro lens was made for this sort of project. It revealed details I'd completely overlooked at the beginning, with twisting stamens, tiny hairs, delicate textures. It provided everything that I'd expect from a good macro lens. Excellent sharpness where I wanted it, but still enough softness and separation to retain that dreamy feel whilst photographing at f2.8. I got quite carried away with time with this lens. It was just so easy to spend lots of time taking photos with it. My Sigma 180 macro lens remains one of my favourite lenses for flower photography. It's heavy enough that the tripod becomes less of a suggestion and more of a requirement. But it consistently produces competition-worthy images, and this project was no exception. I love the working distance on this lens. It helps me to use the shoot-through method, which is so useful when aiming for dreamy floral portraits. Next up was the OM1 and the 90mm macro lens. Everything before this had been paired up with my Sony a7 III. This combination surprised me. On paper it should perhaps have been at a disadvantage, yet it still delivered beautiful results. It's lightweight and easy to use, and proof that sometimes enjoying the experience matters more than obsessing over specifications. The 100-400 telephoto lens was probably the second least successful pairing after the wide-angled lens. Working distance became an issue. The limited space around the flowers didn't really help. The results weren't bad, but compared with some of the other lenses, they lacked a little bit of the intimacy and magic that I was hoping to achieve. Having said that, there are plenty of times I have achieved gorgeous floral portraits with this lens, where there was plenty of space to accommodate it though. Sometimes the dreamlike effect came from the lens itself. Other times it came from experimenting. Deliberate out-of-focus images gave dreamlike memories, and crystal beads held in front of the lens created sparkling highlights. I twist them around until they create a rigid circle which keeps them in place. I sometimes attach them to my Omni holder. I love using the Lensbaby Omni system. It comes with a magnetic ring that screws onto the end of your lens. You then add the filter of your choice and move it around as required until it catches the light. Having the filters held there for you saves a lot of arm ache in holding them there for yourself. Omni filters such as this Omni Crystal and colour filter transformed ordinary backgrounds into washes of colour and light, as well as creating an almost double exposure effect. I also use the Omni holders to add my own homemade alternatives, such as iridescent or holographic coloured semi-transparent film or cellophane sheets held in front of the lens, which produce interesting results. Backlighting often helps enhance the various filters too. The occasional shower followed by sunshine often produced some of the most magical conditions of all. Changeable weather days became a joy instead of hard work. It's a reminder that creativity doesn't always require exotic locations. Sometimes it just requires curiosity and a playful or experimental approach. The longer I spent returning to this patch of flowers, the more I realised something. The flowers weren't really the whole story. They were simply the reason that I kept coming back. Once I started sitting quietly amongst them, an entirely different world began to reveal itself. The nesting blue tits and goldfinches, the wood pigeons following their well-worn pathways through the flower border, the bees moving from comfrey to red campion as the season progressed, a solitary fork-tailed flower bee sleeping amongst the flowers. Spiderlings scattered when disturbed before gathering together once the danger had passed. Ladybird larvae, cocoons and adults. Burnet moth caterpillars creating cocoons, and adult moths emerging and then mating, completing their entire life cycle. When I sat lower down amongst the grass, I felt as though I had wandered into the middle of a David Attenborough documentary. Tiny dramas were unfolding all around me, entire lives playing out at ground level. At first the wildlife disappeared when I arrived, but gradually something changed. The birds carried on feeding unbothered by me. The insects, such as weevils, carried on living their lives. The fledglings arrived, and eventually it felt as though the garden had accepted me as just another harmless object, just sitting amongst the flowers. I had arrived for the flowers, but I stayed for everything else. This project started as a comparison of lenses, wide open. And yes, I learned a few things about lenses along the way, even after having some of them for many years, but that wasn't really the lesson. The real lesson was discovering how much beauty can exist in one tiny patch of wildflowers, how much there is to notice when we slow down, how much creativity can come from staying in one place, and how sometimes the subjects closest to home can end up meaning the most. So whether you have access to a spectacular wildflower meadow, or simply a few flowers growing outside your door, perhaps it's worth spending just a little time with them. Even if you don't have a garden, you can use a pot of flowers in this way, or just visit a local spot regularly. You never know what stories might be waiting there. I will be creating a video in the near future demonstrating more about how I use filters, both ready-made and homemade. So watch out for that one. It'll be full of creative ideas and some new ones too. Thanks for watching.